In the late spring of 2022, Russian forces who retreated from the northern Ukraine after failure to take the capital, Kyiv, shift their focus to the eastern part of the country, Donbas. Here, since 2013, parts of the Ukrainian Donetsk and Luhansk regions have been occupied by Russian proxy states, LPR and DPR. On the border with them, Ukraine has some of its most capable troops, well dug in and reinforced prior to the invasion, as limited advance in Donbas was seen as one of the alternatives to what actually happened, full-scale war. After the redeployment of troops which failed to take Kyiv to the eastern Ukraine, new Russia's strategy is to encircle Ukrainian forces on the east, destroying them once and for all, and annex the entire Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which will open the road to further conquest of central Ukraine. Even more ambitious plans circulate, with the commander of the Russia's Central Military District, Rustam Minnekayev, declaring that the aim of the second phase of so-called special military operation is to fully seize Donbas and Southern Ukraine, establishing a land corridor with Transnistria. On April 10th, Russian Army General Aleksandr Dvornikov is appointed as the commander of all military operations in Ukraine, move that further emphasizes the Russian plans to shrug off defeats of the past and regain momentum. Completely ignoring the enemy's capabilities and how well fortified and urbanized Donbas actually is, the Russians decide to attack in the direction of key cities of Sloviyansk and Kramatorsk, focusing their efforts on Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk first. The city of Sievierodonetsk, with population of slightly below 100,000 people, acted as an administrative center of the unoccupied Luhansk region prior to the invasion. Connected with its twin, Lysychansk, with 3 bridges across the Sievierodonetsk River, the city is an important industrial hub, famous Duazot chemical plant, one of the largest producers of ammonia in Europe. Fast advance in the initial stages of the war allowed Russians to approach the city from the north and east, creating pincers around it. However, once the Ukrainian military reorganized itself after the first strike, defenders dragged Russians into heavy urban combat in Rubizhne by April 20th, slowing down the adversary's advance. The mayor of Rubizhne, Serhiy Khortyev, in the first days of the invasion, betrayed Ukraine and almost surrendered the whole city to the Russian troops, but Ukrainian armed forces prevented the capture. After that, Russians quickly deployed their artillery nearby, starting to methodically destroy the city, while Ukrainians still maintained control over part of it. To the east of Sievierodonetsk, Ukrainian troops organized a few forest ambushes as a delaying action. However, due to the fact that Borova, Yaryk, and Sievierodonetsk rivers split the defensive perimeter into 3 disjoint sectors, a single defensive line was not formed. Therefore, defenders eventually had to withdraw closer to the city. This way, as of April, Sievierodonetsk is already close to being surrounded by Russian forces. For the capture of Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk, Russians deployed the 423rd Motor Rifle and 13th Tank Regiments of the Elite Force Tank Division, the Chechen Akhmat unit of Russian National Guard, and LPR's force, as well as 7th Motor Rifle Brigades, to the area of Rubizhne. The 30th, 74th Motor Rifle and 12th Engineering Brigades are deployed to the west, on the left bank of Sievierodonetsk. To the south of Sievierodonetsk, near Popasna, Russians also gather potent forces of the 102nd Motor Rifle and 163rd Tank Regiments of the 150th Motor Rifle Division, LPR's 6th Motor Rifle and Prizrak Brigades, as well as PMC Wagner mercenaries and elements of Akhmat. Against all these numerous forces, Ukrainians are able to deploy the 57th Motorized, 95th and 79th Air Assault, the 128th Mountain Assault Brigades along Sievierodonetsk, the 4th National Guard, 111th Territorial Defense Brigades, Georgian Legion, and the 15th Separate Regiment of National Guard hold Sievierodonetsk itself. On Popasna's direction, only 24th Mechanized Brigade holds the line with the support of 2nd Donbas Battalion and 1st National Guard Brigade. Such disbalance is explained by the necessity to protect much more strategically important cities of Sloviyansk and Kramatorsk, which are under attack from the north. Right on April 20th, Russian forces are already inside Popasna, but the Ukrainian 24th Brigade and the Donbas Battalion resist doggedly against much more numerous adversaries. At the same time, to the north, the 128th Brigade struggles to hold the Russian advance to the Sievierodonetsk River from Kremenna and Terny. The Sievierodonetsk and nearby towns are under heavy artillery fire, as Russians use a firewall tactic trying to destroy most of the buildings before sending the infantry into assaults. Ukrainians could not counter that, as Russians have multiple times more artillery pieces and ammunition, but the defenders are determined to continue the resistance inside the last unoccupied big city of Luhansk region. In Rubizhne, almost no intact buildings are left, so Russians launch multiple assaults from the two sides, trying to advance deeper into the town. By April 22nd, to the west, the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, thrown back by Russian forces, withdraws to take positions on the right bank of Sievierodonetsk to avoid being encircled on the river bank. In both Popasna and Rubizhne, Russian indiscriminate artillery fire causes not only catastrophic damage to the infrastructure, but also mass civilian casualties. Ukrainian troops, tasked with both assisting civilians in evacuation from the war zone and engaging in combat with Russians, find themselves in the middle of the complete chaos. Nevertheless, they still hold the line, actively using tanks and BTRs to inflict maximum casualties on Russians during the street-to-street battles. When Russians try to use their own armored vehicles, they come under relentless ATGM fire from the ruins of buildings. The resistance is so fierce because the fall of Rubizhne, and especially Popasna, will make it impossible to effectively defend Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk in the long run. Russians also strike in the area of Novotoshkivske with forces of the 150th Motor Rifle Division. Sergei Mikhailov, a battalion commander of the 102nd Motor Rifle Regiment, is killed in action on April 22nd. On April 25th, after heavy losses, Russians eventually push Ukrainians out of Novotoshkivske, further stretching the forces of 24th Mechanized Brigade. Soon, this part of the front line is reinforced by the Ukrainian 17th Tank Brigade. Facing stiff resistance in both Popasna and Rubizhne, Russians ramp up artillery and air strikes, but their infantry is methodically destroyed on the streets, so by the end of the month, not much progress is made. At this point, both towns, however, hardly exist, as most of the buildings are turned into rubble. The only place where Russians successfully advance is the area of Zarychne, where the Russian 15th Motor Rifle Brigade engages in brutal combat with Ukrainian air assault forces for Yampil. On April 30th, a Russian Su-25 is shot down, near Popasna. The pilot, retired Belarusian Air Force officer who was working for PMC Wagner, Nikolai Markov, did not survive. The notorious private military company, under the control of the Russian government, was already spotted near Kyiv, but now they concentrated forces in the Donbas region. Without waiting until Ukrainians established defenses on the other bank of the river, Russians tried to cross Sievierodonetsk using pontoon bridges, but quickly redeployed from Bakhmut rapid reaction forces of the 30th Mechanized Brigade and 2nd Special Purpose Battalion in Donbas, engages armored vehicles, destroying them and forcing Russians to cancel the operation near Dronivka. Now, Ukrainians more closely watch the bank of the river, as chances are high that Russians will try to establish pontoon bridges for river crossings again. This version is supported by the presence of the specialized on river crossings 12th Engineering Brigade in the area, which is supposed to establish a path through Sievierodonetsk for other mechanized forces. The next step would be to cut the vital Bakhmut-Lysychansk road, since current assaults on the Sievierodonetsk are unsuccessful due to intact Ukrainian supply lines. For this ambitious operation, however, they will need to swiftly deploy hundreds of tanks and BMPs of the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade to the right bank of Sievierodonetsk. The operation is also likely timed to be executed around May 9th, Victory Day, to highlight the might of Russian army. To the south, with experienced PMC Wagner troops arriving in force, the Russians slowly drive defenders out of Popasna by May 8th. Ukrainians could have counterattacked the town from both sides, but they alone reserves, as the front line that the mauled 24th Brigade has to control is still huge. Most likely, the Ukrainian command already understands that the fall of Popasna will eventually result in a domino effect, but Ukrainians are determined to fight, to give time to their brothers in arms to establish defenses to the west. Simultaneously, from May 7th to May 12th, Russians construct pontoon bridges across Sievierodonetsk near Bilohorivka and Serebryanka. To the west of Serebryanka, Ukrainians foil an attempt before Russians concentrated major forces, destroying 4 floating bridges, IMR-2 engineering and PTS-3 amphibious transport vehicles, a TMM-3 bridge layer and 2 BMP-1 AMs. These attempts, however, are either diversionary or auxiliary attacks. Unlike previous cases, near Bilohorivka, Russians gathered thousands of personnel with hundreds of vehicles on the Sievierodonetsk bank, preparing to cross the river in force. The massive smoke screens, which are supposed to protect Russians from being spotted, however, are useless and only attract the attention of reconnaissance drones. Once surprised Ukrainian drone operators see the huge formation of Russian forces in the early morning, they relay the information to all nearby artillery and air force units. Just as Russians start crossing the river, a combined Ukrainian strike of the artillery units of the 80th Air Assault and 17th Tank Brigades reaches the area. In minutes, the pontoon bridges are obliterated with artillery fire and tanks with the crews slide right into the river. The fate of those who were waiting on the riverbanks is not much better, as Ukrainians with concentrated artillery fire scorch these areas until no intact vehicles or soldiers are spotted. As the smoke clears after the relentless bombardment, what used to be a river crossing looks like a graveyard of men and vehicles alike. Crossing of the Sievierodonetsk will go into history as one of the largest Russian military failures in this war, and probably in the war history of the 21st century. In the space of just 30 minutes, Ukrainians inflicted up to 1,000 casualties on the Russian 74th Motor Rifle Brigade, destroying 73 armored vehicles. Effectively, the entire mechanized battalion had ceased to exist. Colonel Denis Kozlov, the commander of the 12th Separate Guards Engineering Brigade, is killed by artillery fire as Russian attempts to cross Sievierodonetsk and solemnly march towards Popasna, encircling Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk on Victory Day, turns into a massacre. Only a handful of forces were moved across the river and avoided being destroyed by Ukrainian artillery. Worn down and short on supplies, infantry with few armored vehicles still launch a few assaults on Ukrainian villages along the river, just to be destroyed by much more numerous defenders. Even though Russian river crossing attempts ended in one of the worst battlefield disasters possible, the fact that they happened still ties down some much-needed Ukrainian reserves. Such brigades as 128th Mountain Assault and 81st Air Mobile have to split their forces, with half protecting the west river bank and half fighting in Sievierodonetsk and Rubizhne. There, Russians begin the assaults on Voyevodivka, reinforcing positions with 31st Air Assault Brigade, while Ukrainians there lack artillery currently concentrated near Bilohorivka. At the same time, Russians use bottomless stockpiles of Soviet shells and rockets, slowly fighting their way through devastated streets. It's estimated that only against Rubizhne, Russian artillery uses 1500 shells per day, even occasionally employing 2-ton Tochka-U ballistic missiles. The 27th Separate Brigade of National Guard is deployed to Voyevodivka, but it's merely for delaying action, as Ukrainians have to avoid encirclement in Rubizhne, which for the most part is occupied by Russians. Retreating from Yampil, Ukrainians established a defensive line along Sievierodonetsk that their adversary failed to cross, but Russians still have enough forces to both attack in Popasna from the south, keep Ukrainian reserves tight along the river, as well as continue assaults on Sievierodonetsk. On May 9th, the 17th Tank Brigade also retreats from Nizhny, as Russians try to squeeze Ukrainians into pocket there. By the 12th, the Toshkivskaya is also lost, but the most tense situation builds up to the north of Sievierodonetsk, as Russians eventually drive Ukrainians out of Rubizhne and Voyevodivka. The road bridge across Borova River is destroyed by Russians to prevent Ukrainian orderly withdrawal. However, most of the defenders already crossed the river, and to slow down the Russian advance, Ukrainian Special Operation Forces represented by the 8th Special Purpose Regiment blow up the remaining railroad bridges in the area with a batch of anti-tank landmines. The whole process was filmed by one of the operatives who participated in the operation. Now, the most fierce battles are taking place in the satellite villages of Sievierodonetsk, Shedrisheve and Voronove. Russians also concentrated hundreds of tanks and other armored vehicles, including a company of new BMP-T Terminators in the area of Popasna, where their advance slowed down. Currently, this is the only promising direction from which Russians can launch a tactical offensive to cut out Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk from the rest of Ukrainian cities. Roman Kutuzov, Lieutenant General of the Russian Armed Forces, who is assigned to command the 1st Army Corps, which is composed of DPR forces, arrives in the area of Popasna to conduct an offensive with the reinforcements in the form of the 104th and 234th Parachute Regiments of the 76th Air Assault Division, 137th Parachute Regiment of 106th Airborne Division, as well as 40th and 336th Marine Infantry Brigades. However, Ukrainians either do not see that, fearing the new attempts to cross Sievierodonetsk with the newly arrived 35th Motor Rifle Brigade, or simply do not have enough troops to reinforce the southern flank, as the Sievierodonetsk front is shored up only by single Motor Rifle Brigade, 58th. On May 13th, Russians strike from Popasna, attacking both in direction of Aleksandropil and Pilepchatane with forces of the 40th and 336th Marine Infantry Brigades. By May 16th, fresh Russian forces are making modest progress, but they also drive the Ukrainian 24th Mechanized Brigade that repels dozens of assaults per day to a breaking point. On May 18th, Russians, after launching an auxiliary strike on Orykhove, break through Ukrainian defensive lines around Popasna, sweeping the troops of the 24th Mechanized Brigade there. Through quickly captured Druzhba, they swiftly advance forward, behind Ukrainian lines. However, once the initial breakthrough is achieved by the high concentration of forces near Popasna, further Russian advance becomes quite disorganized, as troops start attacking in all directions before even reaching the key Ukrainian supply route. This results in a wide but not deep enough wedge, as well as Russian vehicles getting ambushed. In one of such videos, Russian VDV forces, likely of the 76th Air Assault Division, on a single BMD-4 drive right into Hirske village, which is fully controlled by Ukrainians at this point. Soon, they are spotted by the drone, and while Russians try to find on paper maps where exactly they are, Ukrainians swiftly organize an ambush. Oblivious BMD-4 drives into the city, and while approaching the intersection, it's hit by autocannon fire of Ukrainian BMP-2 hidden in the bushes. Russians, without even trying to answer with their own armament, swiftly turn to the right, hoping to find cover there, but get right into the trap. On this street, another Ukrainian BMP-2 was waiting for them. It waits for a few seconds until the BMD passes by, and then shreds its thin aluminum armor with autocannon, disabling the vehicle and killing a few crew members. The rest of the Russians run away, just to be soon finished off by the drone-dropped grenades. Such textbook ambushes are something Ukrainians mastered so far, but they still struggle when Russians attack head-on, amassing armored vehicles and personnel. Ukrainians also likely employ aviation to mitigate a breakthrough, losing on May 19th a Su-24M, call sign 69 wide, of the 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade near Soledar. The crew, consisting of Igor Khmara and Ilya Negar, did not survive. Russians, on the other hand, also actively use aviation to support the advance, as on May 22nd, a Russian Su-25 is shot down and crashed near Pilepchatane. What's interesting is that the pilot killed, Kanamat Botashov, was a PMC Wagner contractor, the same as previously killed Nikolai Markov. This shows how mercenaries are gradually getting integrated into all Russian military operations in the region, which will play a big role in future battles in eastern Ukraine. On May 20th, Russians demonstrate 2S-4 Tulpan heavy mortar in Rubizhne, which destroyed the Pavlogradsky bridge that connects Sievierodonetsk to Lysychansk. On the next day, Ukrainians blew up the mortar, but irreversible harm to logistics was already done. Russians, who achieved a significant breakthrough from Popasna, also start facing problems with logistics, as on the way to Komyshovacha, the Russian supply column is destroyed with Ukrainian artillery. The flanks of the wedge created are still not secure, but Ukrainians do not have enough forces to exploit that to the full extent. The Ukrainian 118th Territorial Defense Brigade is deployed to Vrubyivka by May 21st, as well as 115th to Sievierodonetsk, but it's not enough to mitigate a breakthrough. Nevertheless, Ukrainians ferociously fight in open fields against Russians who hold a significant advantage in armored vehicles and artillery. By May 25th, Russians consolidate their positions and further expand the wedge in the Ukrainian defensive line. However, as defenders concentrate significant forces in Vrubyivka, Russians are still kept away from Lysychansk, while the real catastrophe is engulfing the Ukrainian positions to the east of Bakhmut. There, Ukrainians lose a strip of villages from Troitske to Svetlodarsk, because the 30th Mechanized Brigade, similar to 24th, was suffering from lack of reinforcements while holding a huge front line with its worn-down forces. Both experienced units were simply steamrolled by an adversary who held an enormous quantitative advantage and used saturating fire, as Russians reached as far as Bilohorivka, the one that is to the southwest of Lysychansk, It looks like the encirclement of Ukrainians is imminent. Russians throw all their reserves into the wedge, reaching Komyshowacha on the east and Midna Ruda on the west, while believing that most of the Ukrainian units have run away from all their positions as a result of a breakthrough. However, they couldn't be more mistaken. While the 24th Mechanized Brigade regroups and stabilizes the front line to the area of Soledar, the famous defenders of Kyiv, the 80th Air Assault Brigade, arrives in force at the hottest part of the front line. In brutal assaults of May 25th, the 80th Brigade forces Russians, who still inertially advance on the flanks of the wedge, to retreat from Bilohorivka. Next, the brigade establishes a solid defensive perimeter to prevent further Russian advances to the supply lines of Sievierodonetsk. Currently, the only strand that connects Lysychansk to Sievierodonetsk is Proletarsky Bridge, with heavily damaged Yuvaleyny Bridge almost unusable for vehicles. Meanwhile, Russians probing Ukrainian defenses send a recon group that takes a foothold in Hotel Mir and engages in brutal fight with city defenders on the outskirts of Sievierodonetsk. By June 1st, Russian advance from Popasna is practically stopped as Ukrainians stabilize the situation against all the odds. By June 2nd, the only village Russians capture is Nirkove. In Sievierodonetsk, however, Russian infantry advances to the middle of the city through rubble, as at this point 90% of buildings are severely damaged or destroyed. Ukrainians retreat to the Azot chemical factory plant, which is easier to defend under constant artillery strikes. The facility has bunkers and is large enough to accommodate the garrison, as well as the fraction of 12,000 civilians who remained in the city. All this time, the Russian bombardment was a reason why many civilians were blocked in Sievierodonetsk. However, the Ukrainian military and city administration have managed to evacuate approximately 90% of the population, with some remaining residents hiding in bunkers of Azot. The Russian airstrikes on the factory complex on the May 31st also destroyed the tank with nitric acid, which created a huge orange cloud above the city. To halt the Russian advance, Ukrainians sent the newly formed Foreign Legion to Sievierodonetsk. These long-awaited reinforcements to worn down National Guard units and elements of various Ukrainian brigades turned the situation around, as by June 3rd, Metyolkine is liberated, and by 6th, Russians are driven back to the northern outskirts of the city, with Ukrainians controlling around 80% of the area. These remarkable results are achieved both by the fact that many skilled foreign soldiers joined the Foreign Legion and overconfidence of Russians who sense close victory. On the same day, Kyrylo Budanov, the head of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, visits the besieged city to improve the morale of the defenders and inspect the work of his operatives. Indeed, Ukrainian Special Operation Forces assist in the defense of the city, conducting various missions together with other defenders. While it seems like Ukrainians finally improved the situation, Russians, in a number of brutal assaults, take control over Komyshowacha by June 9th. In heavy battles, the battalion commander of the Ukrainian 24th Mechanized Brigade, Maxim Hrebennik, is killed in action. Ukrainians in Zolote, which is a well-fortified area against frontal assaults, suddenly find themselves almost completely encircled. However, they continue to hold the positions, repelling the attacks from the three sides. After the fall of Mariupol, battles for which we covered in a separate video, Sievierodonetsk is the place of the most intense combat on the whole front line. However, battles here still rage not for the ground, but rather for time and initiative. The situation of the defenders is desperate, but they resist, giving time to the rest of armed forces to prepare for both upcoming offensive and defensive operations. Russians also partially fight for initiative to regain momentum lost in the first phase of the war, which ended with a disgraceful retreat from the outskirts of capital. Many units that assault Sievierodonetsk are actually the same troops that were initially deployed in northern Ukraine. Therefore, many Russian commanders there also try to clean their reputation after failure. Not all of them succeed, as even a dazzling advance near Popasna was an extremely costly tactical victory. In battles there, Lieutenant Colonel Aleksandr Stefanov, the commander of the 1st Parachute Battalion of the 104th Airborne Assault Regiment, is killed on May 31st. In the 234th Parachute Regiment of the same 76th Air Assault Division, which fought near Kyiv, Major Ivan Budkin, who served as the Chief of Staff of the 2nd Battalion, was also killed on May 22nd. Finally, on June 5th, the commander of the whole operation, Lieutenant General Roman Kutuzov, was eliminated by Ukrainians in a direct firefight near the village of Mykolaiivka. The Russian political leadership is also severely disappointed with Aleksandr Dvornikov. who failed to organize a quick capture of Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk, even though he was appointed as the commander of all military operations in Ukraine. Allegedly, his primary task was winning the battle for Donbas in 2 months, at most. Instead, under his leadership, the Russian army suffered heavy losses in exchange for extremely limited tactical progress and achieved no encirclements of Ukrainian troops. He is likely given an extra month to finish the task or leave his post. On June 12, the Proletarsky Bridge is destroyed by Russian forces, which served as a last supply route for defenders of Sievierodonetsk. At this point, the flow of supplies is organized with inflatable boats, so the city's fate is decided. On June 18th, Ukrainians shot down Russian Su-25 near Svitlodarsk, once again piloted by Wagner contractor Andrei Fedorchukov, who was captured by Ukrainians after successful ejection. While in Sievierodonetsk brutal combat persists, in the town surrounded, the situation is more or less stable for Ukrainians. Russians, who failed to make a large encirclement of the Sievierodonetsk-Lysychansk agglomeration through convergent strikes from Bilohorivka and Popasna, decide to focus on tactical gains. They put all their efforts into breakthrough in the area of Toshkivka and Ustynivka, which are both currently contested, and by June 20th, gradually fight their way to the road that connects Lysychansk to Zolote. Vrubivka and Metyolkina are also occupied by Russians. On June 21st, they break through Ukrainian positions and get a foothold in Pidlisne and Mirna Dolina. The Ukrainians in Zolote are cut out from the rest of the defenders. However, most of their armored vehicles were withdrawn from the area a few days ago and likely were holding the corridor through which elements of the 21st Mechanized and 17th Tank Brigades successfully retreated. Russians claimed that they took thousands of prisoners, but to this day, no evidence of that was presented. As the number of Russian troops further increases, the Ukrainian defense starts to crumble inside the city as well. Under the cover of the night, on June 23rd, Ukrainian troops are ordered to leave Sievierodonetsk by crossing the river to Lysychansk. The 112th Territorial Defense Brigade is deployed to the city to bolster and cover the retreating forces. Throughout the day, evacuation continues, but in more hastily manner, as Russians see that their adversary crosses the river and employ the artillery to the fullest extent. However, the photos indicate that Ukrainians have managed to evacuate most of their intact vehicles as well as troops, as Russians filmed only destroyed equipment inside the captured city, with the exception of few tanks and BMPs. Even though losses of Ukrainian armored vehicles during urban combat were pretty high, they are nowhere near the extent of losses Russians took during the river crossing in Bilohorivka. Taking positions in Lysychansk, by June 25th, Ukrainians find themselves in a more secure position from the east, as now they are additionally protected by the river. However, after retreating from Zolote, even newly arrived tense mountain assault cannot stabilize the line. By June 27th, Russians fall on the flank of Lysychansk, taking Vovchiyarivka and Mykolaiivka. Ukrainian command, seeing that further defense against much more numerous Russian troops is impossible in unprepared positions which defenders were forced to take, start a withdrawal of the troops. The idea is to, while maintaining order, redeploy Ukrainian forces from Lysychansk to the Bakhmut-Soledar-Siversk defensive line. The 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade, the Freedom of Russia Legion and Kastus-Kalinovsky Regiment are deployed to establish new positions and cover the retreating Ukrainian troops. They engage in brutal combat with Russians to break their momentum. In heavy battles, the commander of the Kastus-Kalinovsky Regiment, Ivan Marchuk, with call sign Brest, is killed in action on the outskirts of Lysychansk. However, the enormous efforts of troops that cover the backing down forces allow other Ukrainian units to conduct an orderly retreat. Some of the most worn down brigades, such as 111th and 112th Territorial Defense, 95th and 79th Air Assault, 17th Tank, 57 Motorized, as well as a few others withdrawn to the rear for replenishment. The battle for Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk, which raged from late April to early July 2022, marked the opening chapter of the larger battle for Donbas. Following a strategic withdrawal from the northern Ukraine, Russian forces refocused on the heavily defended region, aiming to encircle and annihilate entrenched Ukrainian troops and extend their control to the borders of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Adopting strategy reminiscent of Doghead Doctrine, which emphasizes the total destruction of enemy infrastructure to break their will to fight, Russian forces under the command of Aleksandr Dvornikov resorted to massive artillery bombardments. This approach led to the near total destruction of cities such as Rubizhne, Popasna, Bilohorivka, Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk.
Вчора ті будівлі, які ми зайняли, сьогодні вже зруйнувала артилерія їх. Якщо вони помічають, що українські військові тримають оборону, вони не атакують, не захоплюють ці будинки, вони їх зрівнюють з горизонтом.
Despite holding a numerical advantage of at least 3-1 in troops and a significantly larger advantage in equipment, the Russians failed to achieve their planned encirclement and suffered heavy casualties. Ukrainian forces, including the National Guard brigades who were not suited for such intense urban combat, resisted tenaciously. Over more than 2 months, throughout methodical artillery and airstrikes, the Russians managed to push Ukrainians out of Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk, capturing the last piece of Luhansk region. Although this was an important ideological victory for the Russians, what they gained were cities in complete ruins, with infrastructure destroyed and 90% of population gone. On a strategic level, the Ukrainians were not fighting for territory, but rather for time and initiative. They aimed to reinforce a Bakhmut-Soledar-Siversk defensive line and prepare troops for various missions, including an impending Kharkiv counteroffensive. The failure to encircle and destroy Ukrainian troops is blamed on the above-mentioned Aleksandr Dvornikov, who was relieved from his position of commander of Russian forces in Ukraine on June 25th. Some argue that Russians wanted to avoid Mariupol's scenario and aimed to create conditions in which defenders will be forced to retreat through the narrow corridor, taking heavy casualties. The failure to cross Sievierodonetsk, however, left the Ukrainian northern flank completely safe, so after more or less orderly withdrawal, Ukrainian troops were not destroyed and manned solid positions near Siversk. The arrival of American M142 HIMARS systems in Ukraine soon helps defenders counter the Russian firewall tactic. The precision-guided missiles enabled a systematic destruction of Russian ammunition depots, temporarily giving the Ukrainians an upper hand. Despite this, elements of the firewall tactic would remain a significant part of the future Russian offensives, and if the battle for Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk, after its end, was seen as one of the bloodiest during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the following battle for Bakhmut will inevitably overshadow it in this regard.